People like to say, she's old enough to handle it. It sounds responsible, mature, even kind, but no one ever asks what a child has to lose before they earn that label. In my case, old enough didn't mean ready. It meant quiet enough, easy enough to step away from. That was the year I learned the difference between growing up and being left behind while everyone called it independence. If this story resonates with you, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. You're not alone here. I was never the loud one. I wasn't the child adults worried about. No calls from school, no slammed doors, no dramatic scenes. My name is Nora Whitman, and for most of my childhood, I was the kid people described with a shrug. She's fine. She's easy. She doesn't need much. That was the story everyone agreed on, including me. I learned early that being noticed usually meant being a problem, so I stopped doing things that caused pauses in conversation. I ate what was on the table. I finished my homework without reminders. I learned how to be quiet in a way that felt useful. Adults love a child like that. A child who doesn't ask, who doesn't interrupt, who doesn't make their exhaustion heavier. They call it maturity. At 13, people started saying it out loud. She's old enough to handle herself. She understands. She doesn't really need anyone hovering. It sounded like praise. It landed like permission to step away. No one sat me down and said they were leaving. There was no explosion, no slammed suitcase, no dramatic goodbye. Things just thinned out. Dinner conversations got shorter. Questions stopped coming. If I didn't speak first, hours could pass in silence, not angry silence, the polite kind, the kind that looks harmless. I didn't feel abandoned. That word feels too big, too obvious. What I felt was smaller, like I was becoming optional when I was tired. I told myself I shouldn't be. When I was lonely, I reminded myself that other kids had it worse. When something hurt, I learned to explain it away before anyone else had to. That's the trick with being labeled independent. Once people believe you don't need help, they stop offering it. And when they stop offering, you stop expecting. There's a kind of child adults rarely notice. The one who doesn't raise their hand. The one who doesn't cry loudly enough to be inconvenient. The one who shrinks their needs before anyone has to say no. They don't get pulled aside. They don't get checked on. They get praised for coping. And slowly, they learn to disappear in plain sight. No one ever said, "We're stepping back." They said things like, "You're strong. You're smart. You'll figure it out." Those words sound supportive, but they also close a door. Because if you're strong, why would you need protection? If you're smart, why would you need guidance? If you'll figure it out, why would anyone need to stay? This wasn't neglect in the way movies show it. There were no locked doors, no empty refrigerators, no bruises. It was something quieter, a slow retreat that felt reasonable to everyone watching. I still lived in the same house. I still went to school. Nothing bad enough happened to raise alarms, which made it harder to explain why I felt so alone. When adults pull away using logic, it leaves no one to blame. Just a child standing in the gap, wondering when independence became a requirement instead of a choice. I remember realizing that asking for help made people uncomfortable, not angry, just awkward. So I stopped. I learned to solve problems before they were noticed. I learned to keep my voice even. I learned that being low maintenance made rooms calmer. And I learned that calm rooms don't always mean safe ones. People often confuse silence with stability. They see a child who isn't demanding and assume nothing is wrong. But silence is often just a sign that someone gave up on being heard. That's what happened to me. Not because anyone hated me, not because they wanted me gone, but because I was easy to leave behind. When people say, "She's old enough to take care of herself," what they often mean is, I don't have the energy to stay fully present. It's not cruelty, it's fatigue dressed up as wisdom, and children absorb that message without argument. They don't protest, they adapt, they become smaller, quieter, more efficient at not needing. From the outside, it looks like growth. From the inside, it feels like learning how to vanish without leaving a trace. No one pushed me out. They just stepped back far enough that I learned not to follow. And once that pattern sets in, it becomes normal. You stop expecting someone to notice when you're tired. You stop reaching for reassurance. You stop believing you're allowed to take up space. That's the part people miss. I wasn't abandoned by force. I was abandoned by assumption. The assumption that I'd be fine. The assumption that quiet meant capable. The assumption that needing less meant needing nothing. And that's how a child learns to disappear. Not all at once. Just enough each day that no one realizes what's gone missing. Until one day, someone finally asks where you've been, and you don't know how to answer, because you never actually left. After a while, I started wondering something I didn't want to wonder. What if no one ever showed up? Not in the dramatic way people imagine, not with sirens, not with a social worker knocking hard enough to rattle the door. Just nothing. If you've never been 13 and truly alone, it's hard to picture what nothing looks like. It looks like a fridge that still hums, even when it's empty. It looks like the same school bell ringing, even when no one asks who's picking you up. It looks like a world that keeps moving, because your problem is too quiet to slow it down. So I ran the scenario in my head, over and over, like a kid pressing a sore tooth, just to check if it still hurts. If Elliot hadn't stepped in, I would have had 3 options. Not good options, just the ones kids like me usually end up with. The first one is the one adults like to believe in. The she'll be fine option. You stay. You keep your head down. You stretch a box of cereal into a week. You drink water when you're hungry because it buys you time. You tell yourself you're not scared. You're just tired. You go to school like normal. You smile when someone says, "How are you?" You say, "Good," because that's what keeps the questions from multiplying. And if no one notices, you learn the lesson most kids learn too early. Being invisible is safer than being needy. That's survival path number 1, the quiet endurance. It doesn't look like a crisis. It looks like maturity. That's why it's dangerous. The second path is the one people romanticize in movies. The a kind stranger option. You start sleeping at friends' houses. 1 night turns into 3. 3 turns into a week. You learn which parents will feed you without asking too much. You learn to keep your backpack light, because you might have to leave fast. You get good at saying things like, "My mom's working late. My dad's out of town." You rotate your lies the way other kids rotate outfits. You become polite, grateful, easy, because when you're living off other people's kindness, you can't afford to be complicated. That kind of survival looks like community, but it comes with a price. You never fully relax. You never fully belong. You're always waiting for the moment someone decides you're too much. And the third path is the one no one likes to talk about. The system notices option, not because you tell the truth, but because something slips. A teacher asks for a signature. A nurse notices you're losing weight. A neighbor hears you come home to an empty house 1 too many nights. Then suddenly, there are forms, questions, voices that sound professional. People call it help, and sometimes it is. But it's also the moment you realize your life is now a file, a case number, a set of consequences. At 13, you don't understand all of it. You just understand that your story is no longer yours to manage. Those are the three roads: endure, drift, or get caught by a system that was built for emergencies, not for quiet disappearances. None of them are a fair childhood. And the part that gets me is this: most of those paths don't start with a bad kid. They start with a good one. A kid who doesn't scream. A kid who doesn't break things. A kid who tries to be easy. That's why the label independent is so seductive. It lets adults feel proud instead of responsible. She's so mature. She's so strong. She doesn't really need us. Those sentences sound like compliments. But they do a very specific thing. They move the burden. They turn a child's coping into proof that no one has to show up. If you're watching this and thinking, but wouldn't someone notice? Sometimes they do, and sometimes they don't. Because neglect isn't always loud. Abandonment isn't always a door slamming. Sometimes it's a slow fade that everyone calls normal. I used to think being low maintenance made me safer, like if I stayed quiet enough, I couldn't be rejected. But silence doesn't protect you. It just makes it easier for people to step away without feeling like villains. That's the truth society avoids. We praise kids for adapting to pain we should have prevented. We call it resilience. We share it like an inspiring quote. We say, "Look at how strong she is." And we don't ask the more honest question: what happened that she had to become strong in the first place? Because if Elliot hadn't shown up, I would have survived, most likely. But survival isn't the same as being cared for. Survival is what you do when no one keeps their promises. And at 13, you shouldn't have to be good at it. Elliot Whitman didn't arrive like a hero. There was no dramatic knock, no speech about family, no sudden warmth that fixed everything. He showed up the way some men do in the West. Quiet, practical, like he was there because that's what you do. I remember the first thing I noticed wasn't his face. It was his hands. They looked like they'd done real work, not office work, the kind that leaves marks you don't complain about. He stood on the porch and didn't ask me why I was alone, not right away. He looked past me at the hallway, at the empty coat hooks, at the sink without a dish, at the calendar still flipped to last month. Then he said, "Grab your bag." That was it. No. Are you okay? No, I'm so sorry. No promises he couldn't control. Just one instruction. And the strange relief of an adult not making me explain my own absence. The drive to his place felt longer than it probably was. The land stretched out flat and dry. Gas stations with faded signs. A sky that didn't care what was happening under it. I stared out the window and tried to prepare myself for the next version of disappointment, because that's what kids like me do. We don't hope. We brace. Elliot's property wasn't fancy. It was an old ranch house that had been patched and repatched, a weathered barn, a wood shop that smelled like pine and engine oil, the kind of place that didn't try to impress you. It just existed. He walked me inside, opened the fridge, and pointed. Food's there. Then he nodded toward a small room off the hallway. Beds made. Bathrooms through that door. He didn't hover. He didn't crowd me with kindness. He gave me something I hadn't had in a long time. Space that didn't feel like exile. That first night, I barely slept. Not because I was scared of him. Because I was waiting for the catch. I kept thinking, at any minute, he'll realize I'm trouble. He'll change his mind. He'll make a call and send me somewhere else. But morning came, and he was already awake. He handed me a plate of eggs like it was a normal Tuesday, not like he'd just inherited a child no one wanted to claim. At the table, He didn't ask about my feelings. He asked about school. What grade? What classes? Any missing work? Simple questions? Concrete ones. The kind that felt like a rope tied to reality. When you've been floating, reality is a form of care. Elliot believed in routines, not as punishment, as structure. Breakfast happened at the same time. Homework happened before the TV went on. Shoes went by the door. Jackets got hung up. If I forgot, he didn't yell. He just waited until I fixed it. That was his style. Consequences, not chaos. And it did something to my nervous system I didn't have words for yet. Because when an adult is consistent, you stop scanning their moods. You stop guessing what version of them you're getting today. You stop living on tiptoe. He didn't buy me new clothes the first week. He didn't hand me a phone. He didn't try to erase what had happened with stuff. He taught me small, stubborn skills instead. How to make a grocery list that actually lasts. How to count change. How to check the oil in a truck. How to fold laundry so it stacks and stays. He taught me how to show up on time. How to look someone in the eye without apologizing for existing. And when I messed up, he didn't call me ungrateful. He didn't call me dramatic. He said, "Try again." People think love is always soft. Sometimes love is steadiness. Sometimes love is a grown man fixing the fence at sunset while you hold the flashlight, not talking much, just being there. But here's the part I didn't learn until later. Elliot didn't immediately make it official. He didn't rush to court the next day. He didn't file papers the moment I stepped into his house. At the time, I thought maybe he didn't want me enough to claim me. I was wrong. Months later, I overheard him on the phone in his office. The door was half closed. I was walking down the hall with a glass of water, and I heard my name. His voice was calm, but sharp in the way it got when he was serious. "No," he said. "Not yet." A pause. "I'm not doing their job for them." Another pause. "If I step in with paperwork too soon, they get to disappear cleanly. They get to say they handed her off. They get to rewrite what they did." I stood there, frozen, water sweating down the side of the glass. He wasn't hesitating because he didn't care. He was hesitating because he did. He wanted responsibility to have a name, a date, a record, evidence, consequences. He wasn't trying to punish anyone. He was trying to keep the truth from getting buried under polite explanations. I didn't know adults thought like that. Most adults I'd known cared about comfort, about appearances, about keeping things quiet. Elliot cared about what was real. He didn't want a story where everyone could pretend it was mutual, where I was better off, and they were doing their best, where nobody had to admit they walked away. He waited until it was undeniable, until their silence had weight. And then, when he finally did take the legal step, he did it the same way he did everything. No drama, no victory lap, just action. You'd think that would make me feel rescued. What it actually made me feel was something harder. Seen. Because for the first time, an adult didn't confuse my quiet with okay. He didn't call my survival independence and move on. He treated my life like it mattered enough to be protected. Not with speeches, not with money, with presence, with routine, with a man showing up every morning like leaving wasn't an option. And it made me wonder something I couldn't say out loud yet. If staying is love, what does it mean when people don't stay? They didn't come back all at once. That would have been easier to understand. It started small. A message that felt accidental. A name I hadn't seen on my phone in years lighting up the screen like nothing had happened. Just checking in. "Hope you're doing okay. We should talk sometime." No apology. No reference to the silence. Just an opening line, dropped into my life as if it had always belonged there. At first, I didn't answer, not because I was angry, because I didn't know which version of the past they were about to bring with them. Then Elliot got sick, not suddenly, not dramatically, just tired more often, hands shaking when he poured coffee, appointments he didn't explain. That's when the messages multiplied. Calls this time, longer, warmer. They started using a word they hadn't used in years. Family. We've been meaning to reconnect. We always worried about you. You know we love you. Right. Love showed up right on schedule. Late, but confident. They came by the ranch once, stood at the edge of the driveway like visitors who didn't know where to park. They hugged me like they'd practiced. Too tight, too careful. Inside, nothing matched their memories. They talked about the past like it had gone differently, like the years hadn't been empty, like I hadn't learned how to grow up without them. We thought you wanted space. You were always so independent. You never said you needed help. They said these things gently, reasonably, like people explaining a misunderstanding. I watched them speak and realized something unsettling. They weren't lying to me. They were editing. Memory is flexible when there is something to gain. It stretches, softens, finds explanations that don't hurt as much. In their version, they hadn't left. They'd stepped back. They hadn't ignored me. They'd respected my strength. And the more they repeated it, the more confident they sounded. That's what happens when silence goes on long enough. It gives people room to rewrite. Elliot noticed it too. He didn't comment. He just started writing more things down. Dates, times, who called, who didn't. Evidence accumulates quietly. After Elliot passed, the tone changed again. Sympathy came first, then concern, then urgency. We should be involved. It's only right. You shouldn't have to handle all this alone. Alone. That word finally made an appearance. It would have been almost funny if it hadn't hurt. They sat in the living room and spoke like stakeholders, asked about arrangements, about paperwork, about what Elliot had wanted. They spoke as if they'd been part of his life, as if their absence hadn't been total. I kept thinking about the fridge from years ago, how it hummed even when it was empty, how the sound tricked you into thinking something was happening. That's what their voices felt like now. Noise where presence used to be missing. They started using phrases that sound responsible. Best interests. Fairness. Family should stick together. Those words carry weight. They sound moral. They make you hesitate. Because if you push back, you sound cold, ungrateful, difficult. I wondered how many people give in at that point. Not because they believe the story, but because they're tired of being the only one who remembers it clearly. They talked about court before anyone said the word, not directly. Just hints. I'm sure there's a process. I'm sure things can be revisited. We just want what's right. What's right? As if rightness appears when money does. I watched them glance around the room, at the furniture, at the walls Elliot had fixed himself, at the life he'd built quietly. Their eyes lingered longer than their grief. And I thought, if you were me, what would you do? Would you correct them? Go point by point through the years. List every unanswered call, every holiday spent alone, or would you stay quiet to keep the peace? Let their version stand because arguing feels uglier. That's the trap. Silence is how false memories harden. The more you let them sit unchallenged, the more official they become. I started noticing how often they said we thought, we assumed, we didn't know. Shared language spreads responsibility thin until no one feels accountable. They never said, we left. They said, things were complicated. They never said, we failed you. They said. Everyone was doing their best. Those phrases smooth out consequences. They turn decisions into weather, something that just happened. But decisions have weight, and weight leaves marks. Elliot's absence made room for their confidence. Without him, they spoke louder, stood closer, claimed more space. They talked about my future like it was a family discussion I'd missed, about what we should do next. I realized then that grief opens doors, not just to sadness, but to opportunism. People show up to funerals carrying their own agendas. Some bring flowers, some bring claims. And the hardest part isn't recognizing it. It's resisting the urge to minimize it, to tell yourself you're overreacting, that you should be grateful they care now. Care that arrives with conditions isn't care. It's leverage. I kept thinking about something Elliot once said, almost casually. People don't change when they feel guilty, he'd said. They change when something costs them. I didn't know yet what the cost would be. I only knew it was coming. Because when people start rewriting the past, it means the future is already being negotiated. And if you're not careful, you end up erased twice. Once when they leave, and again when they return pretending they never did. So if you were standing where I was, watching people who once vanished now speak the loudest about family, what would you do? Would you correct the story? Would you let it stand? Or would you wait for the moment when words stop working and only proof remains? Because that moment was closer than anyone realized. The reading happened on a Thursday. Not a courtroom, not a dramatic room with polished wood and raised voices, just a quiet office, a long table, paper stacked neatly, like it had been waiting. I remember how still everything felt, even the air. They sat closer to me than before, too close, close in the way people get when they think they belong. Hands folded, faces serious, voices low, like grief had trained them. The lawyer cleared his throat and began. At first, it sounded ordinary. Dates, names, language that didn't care about feelings. Then he mentioned the trust. The room shifted. You could feel it, that small, collective lean forward. The moment curiosity replaced mourning. He explained how it worked, who it protected, who it named. No one interrupted, no one cried, because money sharpens attention. When my name was read, there was a pause. Not a gasp, not outrage, just silence, heavy and calculating. I didn't feel victorious. I felt steady, because this wasn't a surprise to me. I'd watched Elliot prepare this in his own quiet way. What followed wasn't anger. It was bargaining. Not out loud. Not yet. I could see it in their faces, in the way they stopped looking at me and started looking at the lawyer. As if the words might change if they stared hard enough. Then came the letter. Elliot's handwriting was the same as always. Blocky, deliberate, no unnecessary flourishes. The lawyer read it slowly. Elliot didn't talk about love. He didn't explain his feelings. He didn't accuse anyone. He listed facts, dates I moved in, school records, medical appointments, receipts, notes, evidence. He wrote about presents, about who showed up, about who didn't. He didn't say, they abandoned her. He wrote, no contact during this period. He didn't say, I saved her. He wrote, I assumed responsibility. That was his style, not judgment, documentation. I felt something loosen in my chest as the words landed. Not relief, recognition. This wasn't revenge. Revenge wants witnesses. This was accountability. It doesn't ask for permission. I realized then why Elliot never argued with them, why he never corrected their version of events, why he never raised his voice. He wasn't collecting apologies, he was collecting proof. Apologies are soft. They dissolve under pressure. Proof stays. When the lawyer finished, the room stayed quiet. Too quiet. Someone cleared their throat. Someone shifted in their chair. Then it started. That's not how it was. We didn't mean for it to happen that way. You have to understand. Things were complicated. The familiar phrases surfaced, smooth, rehearsed. But this time, they floated without landing. Because the paper didn't argue back. It didn't explain. It didn't soften. It just existed. That's the power of records. They don't care how you feel today. They care what you did. One of them finally said it, carefully, politely. So, there's nothing for us. The lawyer answered before I could. Calm, professional. The trust was structured to prevent interference. These decisions were intentional. Intentional. That word changed the temperature, because intention means choice. And choice means consequence. I didn't say anything, not because I was afraid, because I didn't need to. For once, I wasn't the one carrying the burden of explanation. They tried again, later, not in the office, in the parking lot. This doesn't have to get ugly. We can work something out. We're still family. That word again. Family. When it's convenient. Family. When it has leverage. Family. When it arrives with conditions. I thought about Elliot's routines, the mornings, the consistency, the years of staying. I thought about the fridge that always had food, the table where dinner happened whether anyone talked or not. Family wasn't a word he used much. He practiced it instead. I told them there was nothing to discuss, not because I wanted to punish them, because the discussion was already over. Elliot had ended it on paper. Later, alone. I sat with the letter again, read it slower, not as a legal document, as a record of care. He never once wrote, "She owes me." He never wrote, "I deserve this." He wrote, "This is what happened. This is who stayed. This is who took responsibility." That's why it was stronger than any apology. Apologies ask for forgiveness. Records establish truth. Forgiveness is optional. Truth is not. People often think justice is loud, that it looks like confrontation, that it needs raised voices and dramatic endings. Sometimes justice looks like a file folder, a signature, a system that finally reflects reality. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is stop arguing with people who keep rewriting the past, and let evidence speak instead. I didn't feel triumphant when it was over. I felt finished. Finished carrying what wasn't mine, finished explaining why silence hurt, finished negotiating my own reality. Elliot once told me, anyone can say they're sorry. Very few people are willing to put their responsibility in writing. Now I understood what he meant. Because when love is real, it leaves a trail. And when people try to come back for the benefits, that trail tells the story they wish they could erase. I walked away from that office lighter than I walked in, not because I'd won something, but because, for the first time, the truth didn't need my voice to survive. It was already recorded, and that changes everything. For a long time, I believed that if I felt enough, something would change. If I stayed hurt long enough, if I explained it clearly enough, if I cried at the right moment. I thought emotion was evidence. Families teach you that. They tell you love is feeling, that history lives in memory, that if you remember it differently, it must mean something else happened. That's how damage lasts for decades. Because feelings are easy to deny. They shift. They fade. They get rewritten. I watched it happen in real time. Every time my family came back, they brought a new version of the past. Softer, kinder, more convenient. They didn't lie loudly. They adjusted details. They remembered trying. They remembered calling. They remembered caring. They forgot silence. They forgot absence. They forgot consequences. And for years, I fought them with emotion. I told them how lonely it felt, how confusing it was, how small I learned to make myself. They nodded. They sighed. They said, "We didn't know." And then nothing changed. That's when I understood something no one teaches you. Emotion explains pain. It does not enforce responsibility. Families survive on feelings. They fall apart on facts, because facts demand alignment. Feelings allow disagreement. You can feel sorry and still avoid accountability. You can cry and still repeat the behavior. You can apologize and still expect access. That's why family wounds last so long. They're negotiated emotionally, not resolved structurally. No one writes anything down. No one draws a line. Everyone waits for someone else to be the bigger person. Usually, that person is the child. Elliot never asked me to forgive anyone. He never told me to confront them. He didn't coach me on speeches. He taught me something quieter. Write it down. He said once, not angrily, not dramatically, just practical. Dates, patterns, choices, not to weaponize, to remember accurately. That changed how I saw things, because writing turns emotion into evidence. It slows memory down. It removes drama. You don't write how it felt. You write what happened. And suddenly, the story stops moving. That's what families fear most. A fixed version of events. Because once something is recorded, it can't be softened. It can't be reframed to protect comfort. It creates boundaries without raising your voice. Boundaries aren't ultimatums. They're records of what you will and won't participate in. When I stopped arguing emotionally, people noticed. Not because I was colder, because I was clearer. I didn't say, "You hurt me." I said, "This happened, and this is the consequence." No debate, no performance. That's when the pushback came. You're being harsh. You're overthinking. You're holding on to the past. What they meant was, you're no longer negotiable. That's the real shift. Justice in families doesn't come from emotional closure. It comes from limits, from choosing silence strategically, from deciding not every truth needs a conversation, from understanding that clarity is kinder than endless explanation. I learned that you don't need to convince people who benefit from misunderstanding you. You just need to stop adjusting yourself to keep the peace. Peace built on self-erasure isn't peace, it's compliance. Maybe you recognize this. Maybe you've tried to explain yourself to people who keep forgetting. Maybe you've waited for an apology that never arrives cleanly. Maybe you've been told to move on while the behavior stayed the same. If you're asking why it hasn't worked, this is why. Emotion speaks to conscience. Structure speaks to behavior. Families rarely lack emotion. They lack structure. They lack records. They lack consequences. So nothing changes. When Elliot documented everything, he wasn't being cold. He was being precise. He didn't want apologies. He wanted alignment. And alignment only happens when reality is shared. That's why the trust mattered. Not because of the money, because it locked the truth in place. It said, "This version is final. No more rewriting. No more bargaining." I didn't gain power from that moment. I gained stability. Stability comes from knowing you don't have to argue your existence anymore. If you're watching this and thinking about your own family, ask yourself this. Have you been trying to solve a structural problem with emotion? Have you been explaining instead of documenting, hoping instead of deciding, waiting instead of choosing? Because clarity isn't cruel, it's protective. And sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is stop asking people to feel differently and start acting differently instead. Not loudly, not publicly, just deliberately. That's how justice begins in families. Not with forgiveness, not with closure, but with truth that stays put. And once truth stops moving, everything else has to respond. After the paperwork was done, I thought I'd feel peace. I didn't. What I felt was a different kind of weight. Not the weight of being alone, the weight of being the one who didn't make it right. Because that's what family pressure does. It turns boundaries into guilt. It makes you ask questions in the middle of the night that sound like morality tests. Am I being too cold? Am I holding a grudge? Am I becoming the kind of person I used to fear? I asked myself those questions for weeks. I'd be making coffee and suddenly remember my mother's voice from years ago. Casual and certain. You're fine. You're strong. You don't need much. And part of me would still try to earn that compliment. Even now. That's the trap with being the easy kid. You grow up thinking love is something you prove by not needing anything. So when you finally draw a line, it feels like failure. Like you're breaking a rule you never agreed to, but still lived by. People talk about forgiveness like it has one shape. Like it always ends in a reunion, a hug, a family photo where everyone looks healed. Real life isn't that neat. Forgiveness, for me, didn't arrive as a feeling. It arrived as a decision not to keep poisoning my own days with old anger. But that decision didn't come with an invitation. It didn't come with access. It didn't come with a spare key and Sunday dinners. It came with distance. I had to learn the difference between forgiving someone and returning to the place that harmed me. Because returning isn't always love. Sometimes it's conditioning. Sometimes it's fear of being judged. Sometimes it's the old habit of making yourself small so other people stay comfortable. Elliot never lectured me about this. He didn't sit me down and say, "Here's how to heal." He lived it. He had his own scars, his own silence, his own way of keeping certain doors closed without slamming them. After the trust was read, my family tried a different approach. Not legal, emotional. They sent messages that sounded softer, more human. I miss you. I've been thinking about you. Life is short. Life is short is a powerful line. It's also a convenient one because it skips the hardest part. It skips accountability. They didn't say, "I left." They didn't say, "I failed you." They said, "Let's not dwell." What they meant was, let's move forward without paying the cost of what happened. And if you've lived your whole life being the one who absorbs discomfort, it's tempting. You want to be the bigger person. You want to end the tension. You want to prove you're not bitter. So you consider going back. You picture it. A dinner. A normal conversation. A clean reset. But a reset without truth is just repetition. That's what I finally understood. Forgiveness without boundaries is not forgiveness. It's surrender. And boundaries without hatred are still boundaries. You can forgive someone and still not trust them. You can release the anger and still refuse the access. You can wish them well and still keep your distance. That isn't cruelty. That's wisdom. A lot of people confuse forgiveness with erasing consequences. They think if you forgive, you owe them the relationship again. You don't. Forgiveness is internal. Reconciliation is mutual. Reconciliation requires change. It requires pattern breaking. It requires time. It requires a person who can look at what they did and call it by its name. If someone can't do that, then what you're being asked to return to isn't family. It's a cycle. And cycles don't end because you want them to. They end because you choose differently. There was a moment that made it simple for me. I was standing in Elliot's kitchen, washing a mug, and my phone buzzed. Another message. Can we meet? Just to talk. For closure. Closure. That word always sounds gentle, but sometimes it's just a way to get you back within reach. I looked at the mug in my hand. The same plain ceramic mug Elliot used every morning. Nothing special. Just reliable. And I thought about what Elliot had given me. Not money. Not a dramatic rescue. He gave me a life that didn't require me to beg for permission to exist. Why would I trade that for a conversation that would end with me apologizing for being hurt? So I didn't meet them. Not out of spite. Out of self-respect. I didn't send a long explanation. I didn't list grievances. I just said, I'm not ready for that. And that sentence felt like standing up straight. If you're listening to this and you've been carrying that same guilt, hear me clearly. You are not a bad person for protecting yourself. You are not heartless for refusing to return. You are not obligated to reopen a door just because someone knocks politely now. Tradition doesn't mean tolerating harm. Tradition means responsibility. It means showing up. It means doing the work when it's hard, not when it's profitable. Elliot showed me that. He didn't talk about values. He lived them. So here's what forgiveness looked like for me. It wasn't a reunion. It wasn't a speech. It wasn't a perfect ending. It was waking up and not rehearsing old arguments in my head. It was letting their choices belong to them. It was building a life that didn't revolve around their approval. And it was accepting one final truth. You can forgive people and still not go back. That's not weakness. That's what it looks like to finally choose yourself. When people hear this story, they often say the same thing. You grew up fast. You're so independent. You turned out strong. They mean it as praise. But I've learned to hear what's underneath it. Growing up fast wasn't a gift. It was a response. It was what happened when no one stayed long enough to let me be a child. For a long time, I thought being able to take care of myself was the finish line. If I didn't need anyone, then nothing could be taken away from me again. That's what self-reliant really meant to me back then. Not freedom, protection. I didn't trust comfort. I trusted routines. I trusted lists. I trusted silence. I trusted the version of myself that didn't ask. But somewhere along the way, something shifted. It wasn't dramatic. There wasn't a moment where everything clicked. It happened quietly, the way real change usually does. I stopped thinking of my life as something I had to manage alone, and started seeing it as something I was allowed to build. That's the difference between taking care of yourself and standing on your own. One is survival. The other is choice. Standing on your own doesn't mean you never need help. It means you decide who gets to be close. It means your independence isn't built on fear. It's built on clarity. I used to think my childhood made me strong. Now I think it made me alert. Strength came later. Strength came when I stopped proving how little I needed. Because here's the part people don't like to hear. Early independence isn't a badge of honor. It's often a sign that something went missing. Children aren't supposed to be resilient. They're supposed to be protected. Resilience is what grows when protection fails. That doesn't make you broken. But it does mean the story deserves honesty. I didn't escape the dark by pretending it didn't exist. I escaped it by refusing to live there forever. By refusing to define myself by what was withheld. Elliot never told me to be grateful. He never said, "At least you learned something." He treated my past like something real, something that had weight, something that mattered. And because of that, it stopped owning me. I didn't need to erase where I came from. I just needed to stop letting it decide where I stayed. If you're listening to this and you recognize yourself, I want you to hear this clearly. You are not behind because you had to grow up early. You are not damaged because you learned to cope quietly. You are not weak because you're tired of being the strong one. You adapted. That was necessary. But adaptation doesn't have to be permanent. You're allowed to outgrow the version of yourself that survived. You're allowed to want more than just stability. You're allowed to want ease, connection, rest. Standing on your own doesn't mean standing alone. It means standing without apologizing for taking up space. For years, I lived like my life was provisional, like I was waiting for someone to tell me it was okay to exist fully. No one ever did. So I told myself, that's what this story closes with. Not revenge, not triumph. Permission. Permission to stop calling endurance a victory. Permission to stop mistaking neglect for independence. Permission to build a life that isn't organized around absence. Not everyone who grows up in the dark stays there, but no one leaves it by accident. You leave it by choosing differently, by drawing lines, by telling the truth, by standing still long enough to realize you're allowed to. If this story stirred something in you, you don't need to comment or explain it. You don't owe anyone your history, but if you want to share it with someone who might feel seen by it, that's enough. Sometimes stories don't fix things. They just make people feel less alone. And sometimes, that's the first step out of the dark.